Here, this is actually more realistic of a dogfight than what you've seen like maybe in like Top Gun, where they're just like flying like cool close formation with like beautiful shots. This is actually more representative of what you'll see in the aircraft. So you'll be on a dive delivery or wire, as you see here. You'll employ the gun at a certain airspeed and altitude. And once you employ it and you're done, you're gonna start to pull up to get outside that ricochet. The higher altitude you are, and as you maneuver, it's gonna make it harder for them to essentially shoot you down. Hi guys, my name is David Gregor, call sign Bronzino. I'm currently stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California, and I fly the F-35C Lightning II. Today we're gonna be taking a look at gameplay from Digital Combat Simulator World. Let's take a look at it and see how realistic it actually is. So first thing, you have a B-2 taxiing by, YF-22, that's actually the experimental one going up for the bid, and you're not gonna necessarily have that painted on the tail. You're also not gonna be on the active runway, so runway 3, right behind a B-2 like this. You'll wait for him to take off, and then you'll receive your clearance to take off after he's airborne. If you're getting set up for a dogfight, you'll initially like transit out as 2 aircraft, not necessarily a B-2 and F-22, but you'll transit out together if you're taking off as a section or a 2-ship of 2 aircraft, and you'll do a quick mission systems check where you'll try to lock them up on radar, and then he'll do the same to you just to make sure your systems are working. Quick look at the displays. Obviously, they're not gonna have the classified displays in here, but normally you'll have up your radar on one page, or then on your other display, depending what kind of mission you're executing, you'll have a different one. So it looks like they potentially started already. Normally you're gonna have specific, we call it pads, and that's gonna be your position, altitude, distance, and speed. So you'll have that kind of standardized before you go. You're not just gonna like roll into this. In training, we're gonna have a floor or a minimum altitude that once you're above it, and that's gonna be normally 5,000 feet above ground level. So if you're above the sea, it's gonna be 5,000 feet. Now over mountains terrain, that'll be 5,000 feet above the highest terrain. You can see like the vapes coming off the aircraft when you're pulling high G and or high alpha. You're starting to get those vapes coming off the aircraft's wings, which will be more apparent like the higher alpha fighters, something like F-22 or F-18. You can see here like the buffeting on the aircraft when you're at that low speed, like high alpha, specifically F-18, you can almost know when you're like pulling the appropriate alpha. And alpha is just gonna be the aircraft's nose position vice its actual flight path through the sky. So you'll have a optimum alpha that you're gonna be at to maximum perform the aircraft. And it's actually gonna provide like that actual feedback that you're feeling like via the buffeting. So you can see here, this is actually more realistic of a dogfight than what you've seen like maybe in like Top Gun, where they're just like flying like cool close formation with like beautiful shots. This is actually more representative of what you'll see in the aircraft. The aircraft that you're fighting against are executing your engagement can be a mile, 2 miles away roughly. It doesn't look as cool, but due to like the standoff distance of weapons, when you shoot a missile, it takes a couple seconds for the missile to arm. And these aircraft are traveling at very high speed, so they're not necessarily turning as fast or as quickly as you would as like in a car or in a slower aircraft. So it looks like you're in a legacy Hornet. You can tell by the displays here. You can tell they have the older upfront control panel and then the older fuel gauge kind of down the bottom left there. This actually looks like really realistic. I've never flown a legacy Hornet before, but this is actually looking really good. So as you're flying around, it looks like he's wearing a hammocks. So he's getting that off-board display. And like overall, like as you're looking through the HUD or the heads-up display, it's just looking like really, really accurate. And that's what you would see in real life. So he's got rockets on. If he was actually going at real life against SA-10, you're gonna be carrying a HARM or high-speed anti-radiation missile to give you a little bit standoff distance to the SA-10, and you're gonna be up at a way higher altitude. Higher altitude's gonna allow you to do is to defend, and as you're defending, you're gonna be losing airspeed as you pull high G maneuvers, so you can descend as you're defending. That's also gonna provide you more standoff distance with your weapons, and it's just gonna provide you more lethality while remaining survivable. Rockets and SA-10 is not going to be the best kind of game plan there. If you're picking these up visually, unless if they have some degradation in their systems, they're going to be shooting you well prior to you getting within like rocket distance, especially in a legacy platform that's not going to have any RCS or radar cross-section management done to the aircraft. But you can see the acceleration that the aircraft down at low altitude and afterburner is gonna be pretty good. Again, you don't really wanna be at low altitude, not only for going against the SA-10, but you might have other weapons or enemy weapons within the environment that the lower you are, the easier it is to shoot you. So you're gonna be up at altitude and you can have more airspeed on the jet. But you can see it looks like he's carrying the rockets. He's got 2 A120s and it looks like potentially 2 HARM on the aircraft as well. Flying around in afterburner, there's low altitudes also not good. There's IR-guided surface-to-air missile sites that could be within the vicinity, and those can be something as simple as like a shoulder-launched rocket. You don't want to be flying around in afterburners. They're gonna have an easier job acquiring an IR lock on you and employing that weapon. You're also not gonna be flying around with your formation lights on. Those are those green strips that you see illuminated along the side of the aircraft. Those are mainly used at night in training scenarios to make the aircraft more apparent to the people that you're working with. You see those X's in the display, that's a brake X. You will get that as you're employing weapons, and that's gonna differ from platform to platform, whether it's an F-18, F-16, F-15, F-35, to what necessarily that brake X means. So you just jettisoned off both of those rocket pods. That's something that you would potentially do if you're defending and you're losing airspeed and you need to regain airspeed. Landing on a naval aircraft is gonna be a little bit different than a commercial airliner or an Air Force aircraft. We'll actually just fly the landing all the way to touchdown instead of doing like a flare like you would in a gentle landing for passengers or just for the aircraft's kind of gear where it's not as robust as an F-18. F-18, you can also do conventional or a flared landing at a home field or at a regular air base, and that's gonna be absolutely acceptable and fine. So let's say you're taking off in the Harrier. I've never flown a Harrier. It's gonna have the ability to take off conventionally or do the VSTOL, so vertical takeoff and landing. Doing a aileron roll right after takeoff. You can see it's pretty sporty. It's usually prohibited outside of like the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds, even like the tactical demonstration teams will have specific instructions on if they can even execute it, but if so, at what parameters, just due to the risky nature of that. Overall, it looks like the inside of the cockpit, at least from what I've seen from a Harrier, looks pretty representative. Everything down from like the control stick to the buttons on the panels to the actual display. Harrier versus a MiG-21, the Harrier is designed for air-ground or air-surface environment, where the MiG-21's an older aircraft, it's a former Soviet Union aircraft, so neither of these aircraft are necessarily designed for dogfighting or 1v1 BFM. See, it's relatively like realistic, like the MiG-21's putting out flares, as it's sensing that it's defensive. And now just like the overall geometry of the fight, you can see this is way more realistic, at least in terms of how they're executing the maneuvers, in terms of something like Top Gun or what you would see in something like Ace Combat. A big thing that a lot of people don't realize, like as you're executing these maneuvers, like energy management is a huge consideration. And so you actually have airspeed bands that you're trying to necessarily stay within in order to maximum perform the aircraft, whether that's for like turn rate, so how fast you can transverse across a circle, or turn radius, and that's gonna be like the distance that it takes you to turn. So right here, they're in like a vertical, essentially a 2-circle fight, which they're gonna reference a turn rate, how quickly they can transverse across the circle. The MiG-21's obviously defensive here. As you can just see that the nose of the Harrier is pointed at the MiG-21. The MiG-21's constantly putting out flares, suggesting that they're defensive. Not sure what the Harrier pilot was doing there. That's not necessarily finding its best game plan. I'm not sure if he's run out of bullets, and if you do so, you have no more weapons to employ. You could potentially look to bug out or just try to run away, essentially, if you're out of ammunition to employ against the other aircraft. So it looks like he's coming in here for a vertical landing, or kind of like a hover. It's literally what the Harrier is like built around, is to land vertically, whether that's out of like an improvised field or off a amphib. And we're taking a look at refueling in flight. So this looks like potentially you're in an F-14. One's just passing off underneath your left wing and up in front of you. So at least it's gonna be a probe and basket. So you can see there where it differs from the Air Force style, where they'll have a boom. You're literally just trying to stick the probe in the basket. So these are wingtip pods off of, looks like a KC-135. Not as bad as what the Iron Maiden would be, which a lot of naval aviators really dislike, where it's a hard basket coming off the boom of the aircraft. Once you're plugged into these baskets, at least on the wingtips, fairly benign once you get in. Getting in might be a little difficult because you'll get lift created from the wings and wingtip vortices and a little bit of distorted air coming off the engines. That might make the basket dance around a little bit, but once you're in, it's fairly stable. So like immediate thought process of looking at this cockpit, you can obviously tell it's an older cockpit. It's not gonna have the displays that a newer aircraft would. You can see a lot more like steam gauges and just a lot more complexity in the cockpit here. I haven't flown a propeller aircraft in the military, at least, since primary flight training, which was 8 years ago. Now, do a lot of skills translate? Absolutely, 100%. But you can see that the way that the cockpit is, you're not displaying the information in the same format. So it would take some getting used to. But reading through checklists, going through if there's a simulator for this would be something that you can do to make the transition a little bit easier. It looks like it's potentially tailwheel aircraft, so you can see like the forward visibility outside the cockpit is completely different than what you would see in modern aircraft. A lot of people will go through, at least on the military side, will go through simulators with old sim instructors who were flying aircraft from Vietnam, First Gulf War, etc. So they'll impart some like shared experience where you talk about your experience, they'll talk about their experience. We'll also have to do threat studies. So we'll have to know like how various other aircraft from hostile nations or threat nations perform. And some of those nations will fly older aircraft. So not necessarily like U.S. aircraft, but they might be flying something like a MiG-21 where that's an older aircraft with old avionics, an old cockpit setup. So we'll have a rough idea of not necessarily what's inside, but we'll know that the cockpit has poor ergonomics and how that will affect the pilot. And like aircraft performance looks a lot more realistic than some of the other like games, like videos you've seen of military aircraft. And something like P-47 from its era, like it's gonna have to employ the guns or it's gonna have to drop bombs ballistically. So they're gonna have to get closer into the target than we would have to with modern aircraft with modern weapons and mission systems. So you can see they're shooting like essentially tracer rounds, and that's gonna give the sight that's shooting at you an indication of like where the bullets are actually going. They now, would it be in that quantity or that frequency of tracers, depending from the error. What's also doing, it also allows the pilot to see where the firings come from. Now, would he be getting necessarily that low and close? No, you can have bullets ricochet and potentially impact the aircraft. Now, ricochet is not gonna be as deadly as if you got hit by the bullet as it was firing, but that's still a consideration you have to take into account. But you can see kind of just like the rolling in aspect, like for strafing, is what we'll call like shooting the gun. Like you will execute a roll in. So you'll be on a dive delivery or wire, as you see here. You'll employ the gun at a certain airspeed and altitude. And once you employ it and you're done, you're gonna start to pull up to get outside that ricochet. The higher altitude you are, and as you maneuver, it's gonna make it harder for them to essentially shoot you down. I don't know what kind of bombs they are on the left and right wing, but that would be something where you could potentially employ via a dive, a delivery. Now, it's gonna be an unguided bomb, so not necessarily the most accurate, but it's gonna give you a little bit more survivability as you're able to employ that from a higher altitude and a little bit further of a distance. And you can see one of the other drawbacks from being like a tail wheel as it's coming to land. Again, that visibility is not necessarily the best, but you're never gonna be like landing on a runway where you should have to be worried about obstacles. You might have an aircraft in front of you if you came back as a formation, but they're gonna be thousands of feet in front of you on the runway. So that should not be a huge factor. It'll be more of a consideration for necessarily like seeing like runway center line. As you can see here, as he's in a lower altitude environment, as he's coming into land and execute his flare, that you're only really getting visuals out the side or so far above the horizon in front of you that you can't really see down the runway at all. Thanks for watching DCS World with me. As a simulator, it actually does a pretty realistic job at least showing you the inside of the aircraft and what it actually looks like. While some of the tactics or weapons deliveries were a little unrealistic, I think it did a better job than a lot of other games I've taken a look at. If you want to see more videos like this, head to the Gamology YouTube and Facebook pages. So landing in a fighter jet is actually really, really easy, at least on land. Okay. Yeah, I'm at a loss too.